So there are probably few people in Australia actually as qualified to talk to you as our next speaker, who has crossed traditional journalism, digital publishing, government, politics and the public sector. He is a former executive editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, chief political correspondent for the Australian Financial Review, has worked at the Centre for American Progress in the United States. He served as president of the Media Alliance and was chair of the Walkley Foundation for 7 years. He holds both commerce and law degrees from the University of New South Wales and has lectured on digital strategy and media at Johns Hopkins University and the University of Technology in Sydney. He's recently been seen around Canberra helping people with this big digital transformation thing, and somehow also finds time in all of this to run the Mandarin, which is the disruptive new destination for the political digerati. Please welcome Mr. Tom Burton.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thank you for the warm welcome. Great to be back here in Canberra. I spent many years living here and love the place. And what a beautiful day, and you come and you feel what a great place to live. So thank you very much, and Chris was very kind with that introduction. In many ways, I do feel I've come back to a community I've spent quite a lot of time with. After I left the Sydney Morning Herald, like all journalists, about 10 years ago exactly, I thought I could do it a lot better and head out on my own. And I took up Drupal as my publishing system and got at that stage, a 17-year-old to help me code it up and bring together a site called australiatalks.com.au. Now, as it was at that stage, there was a guy called Mark Zuckerberg who also had a bit of vision for Facebook. And we're emerging about the same time, 2006. Facebook started 2004, but actually didn't go public till about 2006. Now, australiatalks.com.au was Australia's version of Facebook. Now, sadly, he won and I didn't, but it was built on Drupal, and that's where I started to learn it. And I coded myself, and I spent a whole year getting my fingers really dirty on all that code base. So having been a failed lawyer and a failed economist and a failed journalist, I then became a coder. So the site went somewhere, and I still hold the URL, so anyone who wants it, it's got value. But it's funny how these things move, and I always say to my kids and others who listen, look, every bit of your career is a learning path and introduces another piece. So I wandered over to Washington. My wife had got a job with the Sydney Morning Herald in DC, and I was busily enjoying, Washington Import's delights. Someone rang me and said, you know something about Drupal, don't you? I said, well, a bit. And he said, we've got this organisation and we've got all these sites, all these Drupal sites. We've got like 80 of them, we're trying to work out what to do with them. So I got sort of brought in as a responsible adult, and that's always dangerous when I'm the responsible person. I'd been there about 3 or 4 days. It was obvious what you had to do. Sites all over the place, and you just had to clean it up and get it sort of focused. And I said, what is this place? And I said, it's the Centre for American Progress. And I'd been a political journalist, right? It's such a dumb story. And sort of prided myself on my political acumen. And I said, what's it do? What is this? There's some bloke and his name's Barack, right? Anyway, you know where this story is going. Centre for American Progress was his sort of policy unit. And we were doing what we called advocacy journalism at that stage, and it was all built a lot on Drupal sites. It had a whole lot of other stuff too. So Drupal sort of walked me into that world, and that's where I saw, the big sort of, if you like, government tech engagement play full on starting to happen. That was the first version of it, running into 2008, and of course there's a second version. So that's where I started to really see this sort of interplay between technology and government and engagement and all that. And then I was sitting in DC and said, having a cup of coffee with someone, an Australian guy who ran the Australian Communications Media Authority at that stage. And I was sort of thinking coming back to Australia, and I was telling him, you've got to get on top of this whole digital piece. It'll eat agencies like you. Engagement's coming, and if you don't get practical about it and start to learn this yourself, and everyone's got a megaphone and start doing it. Anyway, he convinced me to come back to his agency, so then I walked into the Australian Communications Media Authority, had their digital remit, if you like, and then we rebuilt the website, etc., etc. So that's a long story to perhaps give you a bit of a sense of where I've come from and where I am. The Mandarin was really my latest version of saying, look, we've got to get a better quality conversation between government and all the people who play around government, and they're people who play in lobby groups and vendors and in this community here is another group. So the whole mandate of the Mandarin is to try and promote that conversation. I'm really pleased we've got a relationship both with Acquia and Finance trying to build the community around Drupal and everything. So I've been personally very into that spot. So when Chris asked me to speak, I said, sure, happy to come along. I'd like to talk today about a couple of things, just go through some of the drivers, some of the bigger picture things. I think when you work in the technical side of things or engagement side of things, you can sometimes lose the bigger picture. And I always say to people, follow the dots and join them up. That's probably an old journo trick, but it's definitely true and it gives you sense and context. So I'd like to talk about that. I'd like to look at what I think are some of the particular drivers, particularly here in Canberra, but government in general. And then have a bit of a sense where we are, try and map where we are, because sometimes you get lost in that. And then look at really how you drive some of these digital products, because I think that's a piece that sometimes the building bit's the easy, that's the driving of it. And then if you haven't got sick of me, I'd like to give you a few sort of just high-level thoughts about some of my own observations about the system. So we'll charge through that. All right, I just want to check the audio. Can everyone hear me up the back? Terrific. All right, thanks. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end, so certainly feel free to take questions. So big picture, where are we? I think definitely in government is starting to feel that, the hot breath of, big digital disruption. Government's been relatively slow in that place. Media got affected a lot earlier. A lot of e-commerce got affected a lot earlier. Or commerce got affected. And government sort of resisted a bit for various reasons. But I do think it's the arrival of these smartphones that have really changed that proposition. Why smartphones? Because they've just empowered citizens, right? And all of a sudden citizens, you can be, have a fascination with motor cars and you can be a senator in the Australian Parliament pretty quickly. You can self-organise, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a really rapid organisation of what I call the tribes. So movements that perhaps would have taken 20, 30, 40 years to take hold are coming together really quickly and throwing their weight around. Gay marriage is perhaps a good example of that. I think in the 70s that would have taken 20 to 30 years to get going. That movement's moved really quickly, as an example. Violence against women at home, really that was a website started in Sydney sort of 18 months ago that really sparked it, started counting the deaths. Little social media site called Destroy the Joint, run by a woman out of UTS, and that's really picked up and moved. So why am I drilling on this? Because the tribes are empowered and they're moving quickly. And I think, big government, particularly the bit up the hill here, is really struggling with that concept. We are seeing the flip. We talk about citizen power, we talk about consumer power, we talk about all that change. Well, this is happening and it's watching it. And everyone's struggling with it. So, in a sense I say, what's the job for over the next 5 to 10 years of people like us? It's to navigate through that in a sensible sort of way. Don't get freaked by it. It will be noisy and it will test us, but that's the reality we're dealing with. And often say we're in the sort of silent movie phase of the web. We're still trying to work it out, and this is a big change happening. So that proposition. We're seeing very big new business models emerge. For example, the very big platforms, the Facebooks, the Googles and the Apples. These are of huge global scale, clearly confronting governments in many ways, not just at the sovereign level, where many of them are cut through government very quickly in terms of their ability to communicate directly, but in regulatory terms and in control terms. So a lot of the e-safety type issues, etc. And government's really struggling to come to terms with that proposition. They're very big, they're moving fast, and they're consolidating at a very rapid stage. We're seeing some very interesting business models emerge. The collaborative economy is probably my favourite one. This is the Uber and the Airbnb. This is the shared economy proposition. Now, some people say the shared economy will be 20% of the developed economies by 2020. So that's 4 years away. And you've already seen how quickly something like Uber and Airbnb have disrupted massive parts of the economy. And so that piece, just as an example, but also a very real point, is really confronting government. It's peer-to-peer review. If I get an Uber taxi, the taxi driver rates me and I rate them. Do I need regulation anymore to manage and register taxi drivers? My view would be no. So yet we've got whole regulatory structures doing that. So you've got a government really being challenged by these new areas. New technologies, driverless cars is a really good example. The state of California's just put out its first regulatory draft on how to deal with driverless cars. Much to Google's chagrin, it's saying you've got to have someone who can drive the thing, right? You can't just sit there. Google says, look, the humans are actually the problem. So we're going to see a really interesting worldwide debate about this. Volvo, who says whether they don't want anyone to die in a Volvo after 2020, have worked out the only way they can make that promise come to life is to have driverless cars. So this is like 2 to 3 years away, and you only have to drive around to say no, that we don't have the systems to do that. So these really big moving pieces really confronting government and really starting to make their challenge. We talked about the empowerment of citizens through mobile phones, and that's profound and noisy and very active and really, I think, challenging the political system big time. So what are we seeing there as a sort of observation? Government struggling, really struggling everywhere. We're seeing lots of this playing out in Europe, we're seeing it in the US, Canberra, so it's not an Australian thing, it's generally that sort of proposition. It's useful to reflect on that and say, okay, we're all in this, we've all got to deal with it. And so, have I got a big answer for it? No, but it's just to know that we are sort of part of some broader zeitgeist. So let's think about the public sector and what's sort of driving that piece, if you like. Chris put up the obvious slide, digital transformation. Now, digital transformation at one level is the promise by most governments in Australia to digitalise a vast majority of their services. Comes in different flavours. I think New South Wales, the Premier said one of the top 12 promises is that by 2019 they'll have 70% of their services delivered digitally. I think Turnbull's promise is the majority of services by the end of 2017. Well, that won't happen, but it's a big promise, so it's driving a lot of activity. South Australia, easily the most progressive and interesting, I think, of the Australian jurisdictions. Well worth keeping an eye on. Right? Why the Premier there, Jay Weatherill, sort of had a near-death experience politically a couple of years ago, almost lost the election and said, well, I'm just going to go, And I clearly can see the punters don't like the way the government runs. I'm going to change. So he's brought a whole refreshing change in, a really different sort of way of thinking, and they're opening government up and doing all sorts of things. So you're seeing all these different governments really pushing and trying to make a change. So the digitalisation piece, and of course here in Canberra, the DTO has been pushing that piece quite strongly. The big innovation play, our grand leaders obviously made that the big byword for his government, and that's driving a lot of energy and change, and you're seeing all sorts of things. You saw just before Christmas quite a few announcements there, some quite interesting ones. Data by default, we finally got that, open data by default, we've got that in a statement just before Christmas. We've got a big program to push APIs out there. Data 61, the former NICTA, it's been merged into CSIRO. In my view, probably not the smartest thing, but they've done it. And it's got a big remit to try and bring together the cybersecurity piece. So at the moment, we've got a lot of investment in cybersecurity within the security side of agencies, but not a lot outside, so to try and bring that together. Big opportunity, very interesting. And then, of course, there's the digital marketplace, which they're playing with this whole idea of trying to open up the government to smaller providers, which I'm going to say quite a few people in this room come from. It's based on a UK exercise, and I think quite exciting if it can come to place. Service unification, boring managerial word, but what it is bringing all the services into one. Service New South Wales is probably the best leading example. So that's crunching everything together. That's certainly a driver. Okay, so if we're trying to think about, okay, what are these drivers? Digitalisation, one, or service unification, a second. Service unification in many ways is pushing things harder than the actual digitalisation process itself, because it's saying in New South Wales, in 18 months, they took 400 services and crunched them together. Ran a bit of, it's a Drupal front end, it's a middleware by Salesforce, and they just crunched it. Set up a whole new agency. We're not having agency wars, we're setting up a whole new agency, we're going to do it, right? And they're sort of, I think, through their first generation, and now we're going to see the second. I think you'll see a lot more business process reform underneath, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't take too long to go through Service New South Wales suddenly to be caught up in RMS, which is the roads and traffic mob, and that's not particularly pretty. So all that you can see, second phase, that's got to start getting cleaned up, but it's a big push. Victoria put their business case together doing the same. So it moves very quickly, okay, and we've got gov.au here, which will be an interesting play as well. So, that's a really big change agent, and really starts, I think, to question, well, what are the role of individual agencies, public agency sides? And we really haven't had that debate. In the UK, they just charged ahead, and now they are starting to have that debate. In many cases, they've closed them down. In other cases, they're saying, well, we're not quite sure. So that's going to be a tricky space, and one we all need to sort of think about and what is the best way forward. There you go. Big focus on outcomes. You know, outcomes is one of those sort of, again, words that particularly Department of Finance love, but it's a very important thing to get our head around. It says, okay, we're not going to just track all the inputs and all the outputs. You know, we're not going to look at, say, in health and say, well, how many people went through emergency wards? You know, we're going to say, well, how many people are well? And how do we make them better? And that may well be an obesity program that keeps them out of hospitals and out of the health system. So you focus on outcomes, you get a very different answer to the problem. Okay? And it's a very powerful process. And you see words like outsourcing, like commissioning, those sort of words. They're the words that people are using. In the States, they're starting to pick it up big time. And it's a very different model. Probably most importantly, it starts to flip government out. It starts saying, okay, we, the government, will not be doing this. We, the government, will be commissioning others to do it. And we, the government, will listen to providers outside and start to hear what their solutions are. And if you want a living example of this, it's Child Story out of New South Wales, Family and Community Services. So it's a $100 million platform they've commissioned, and it's a platform essentially for children at risk. These are kids in the New South Wales at risk. And often what happens, there's a social worker, there's a copper, there's a teacher, there's a whole lot of people touching these kids and listening to the issues and having to deal with them, touching them in the sort of managerial sense, but never shall those communication dots be brought together. So the social worker files it in a cupboard somewhere, the teacher's keeping it here, the copper's there. So what Child Story, this is a gross simplification, tries to do is bring all that together and then give the front end staff real power to manage that. Anyway, they put the whole thing out. It's well worth looking at the website, childstory.net. Good website, nicely communicated, and they've gone through this process essentially saying to the market, well, you come up with the solutions, okay? So 8 or so providers have, and they've come together to try to do that. And it's just a really interesting case study, I think, of what new gov's going to start looking like, much more outward focused. How you design that, how you put that together is a really interesting challenge. So that much more throwing it open to the market or the community or whatever you want to call it and asking them to find the problem. And then, of course, we've got the efficiency and rationalisation pieces, that's not going away. And I don't make myself terribly popular when I say this, but I think there's a good 25 to 35% efficiency dividend waiting to come out of government. Why do I say that? I've just seen other arenas. I work in the private world now, but I came out of the public world. And we're driving efficiencies in the private world now, probably the 5th generation. It doesn't stop. And we just got to stop deluding ourselves that we are delivering at good value. There are large layers of bureaucratic costs sitting in our system. We've not found the way to really honestly address those propositions. Now, this is a little bit of a mantra of mine. This is not, I'm a big fan of government. I'm not ideologically, this is not an ideology observation. It's about the way we deliver these services, right? And we've got to get a lot more efficient. And a lot of that, I think, is going to be tied up in platforms and platform growth. We'll come back to that. I think GovCMS is a really good example of that sort of efficiency thinking. We're going to drive it at a higher level. We're going to drive this at a much better way. We can't be building websites at $1.5 to $2 million type costs, or 3 or 4. Right? When I checked back, this is probably 3 years ago, the average cost of building a website in the Commonwealth was around about 2 and a bit million. It was just ridiculous. Let's go to what? It's everything, right? Not just the dev, it's everything, right? We can't be building them at that price. We've got to be building them like once every year, again and again and again. And we've got to be building for hundreds, if that. When I walked into my place, I said, we're going to build a website for $5,000. Right? That's the sort of cost. And I said, if we build it for more than that, I'm out of here. Now, everyone freaked, but we did. Right? And it's basics, really simple site, but it's just publishing, right? But they're the sort of aggression and pricing we've got to get used to. Not great news if you're in the dev community, but ongoing. There's still a lot of I think work there to be had. One other piece, just to note. We're in a great period of political enlightenment at the moment. We've got a Prime Minister who gets it, right? Doesn't totally get it, but he gets the feel for it. He understands why you've got to go for it. And he's permissioned the public sector to get on with it. So that's huge. We all know what that means. That really starts to green light the top end of the public sector. There are plenty of progressives in the system already, but there's a certain degree of frustration. Well, now there's absolutely no reason. He's saying get on with it. New South Wales, similarly. South Australia, similarly, right? Victoria, almost, not quite getting there. Queensland, starting to, okay? But we've got really progressive. Where you see that matters is New Zealand. New Zealand made this call 5 years ago. They're part of the D5 now. They're the 5 leading digital countries: UK, New Zealand, South Korea, Israel. Who did I miss out? UK, I'll remember them. But New Zealand's one of those. And why? They just said we're going to go for it. And they permission changed and they got on with it. So it's hugely beneficial. Take advantage of it. Take advantage of it and go. So where are we at the moment? Simple observation, but let's make it. I think we're digitalising point solutions broadly. We're doing that. We're building new websites and we're digitalising point solutions. So things that were form, PDFs or download, or you had to print the silly thing out, you can now start doing it online. So, and that's a good thing. Nothing wrong with that. We're starting to really upgrade the engagement piece, obviously. So a lot more websites are getting a lot better at that. The Commonwealth was famously bad at it. And there's still some, notorious ones out there. But we're quickly moving away from that. And every day you wake up and there's one better site and one better site, and everyone's learning a lot better about that. So the engagement piece is really happening. Where's the next phase? Well, I think the joined up services piece is really the challenge, and we're starting to see that. DTO's got a model where they're going to try and run business applications through one customer exercise. So that's a really important, I think, prototype project. Why? Because they've got to talk with 3 levels of government. Federal, state and local. Local does all the health and stuff. State does all the licensing at state level, and then federal through that exercise. So that's a really important exercise of joining up the dots through the federation, right? And it also means agencies have to talk to each other. It means we've got to plot the journey end to end, right? So you can see all those challenges and why that's a really interesting project. And I think we're going to see, that writ large, this sort of joining up of these services, And that's where we've got to obviously go, because from consumer perspective, the citizen perspective, they don't have much time for running around navigating the tiers of government and the various agencies. So that piece we've got to get good at. Huge challenge because the Australian federated system is not good at it, has never been good at it. And it amazes me how different jurisdictions just don't talk to each other. Agencies, even within the same jurisdiction, are very ignorant of each other's work, and we've just got to open that up. And that's why I think conferences like this, where everyone's talking and hearing and understanding, are really, really important. Data obviously starts to become really important. I think this is going to move much quicker than we all anticipate. I think the data piece is going to move, big time. Why? Because all of a sudden governments are starting to understand, well, with data I can do lots of things, particularly real-time data. You've already seen emergency services, data starting to play quite a significant role already. And then we'll start seeing it in health, and we'll start seeing it in education, we'll start seeing it in traffic management, we're already seeing it. So people are getting it, that data matters, And they're starting to connect that and start saying we can run with that. And with data comes cognitive, okay? So cognitive piece, which is self-learning computers that look at data and start to learn. So I think that's going to move big time. And you can see it in the big vendors. One of my partners with the Mandarin is IBM, so I have a fair bit to do with that space, this cognitive space. They've got that Watson product. But so does SAP, and there's a bunch of others out there. And the cognitive piece is moving big time. And I think for government, it's such a natural play. I actually think, if we're here tonight and we're having lots of drinks, I'd bore you silly with my idea that government's going to become essentially a data play. That over time, let's take weather, Bureau of Meteorology, right? Weather, they collect the data of weather, right? And then they just let everyone play on that platform, okay? So there's no real need, in my mind, for the Bureau of Meteorology to be providing services. You let providers do that. That's what, essentially governments are not that good at, front-end delivery. That's just not what they're made for. But a lot of service providers are. That's what they are made of. So government's got to understand what role it plays. Where does it sit in that ecosystem? It sits much better at the platform level. And in my mind, it sits at the data level. There's a guy called Philip Evans who writes about this out of BCG, Boston Consulting Group, and Harvard. Well worth reading. And I made an attempt, a pretty tawdry attempt to he did a good piece about it for corporates, and I tried to make it live for government. So if you just Google that, Evans, myself and Mandarin, you'll see it. But it's, I think, quite a powerful concept. It starts saying, government really becomes a data layer, and it doesn't need to be playing at the application level so much. That's profound change. You can see what that means both ideologically and in structural change. So data becomes important. Business processes, I think this is the engine room stuff. This is what I mean by efficiency. We cannot have whole sections and branches sitting there managing applications in the most old world, slow, heavily bureaucratic, highly cost way, okay? And we've got to get real about that, okay? And governments are not good at that work, and we've been doing it the same way essentially we've been doing for 30 years. So a lot of business process improvement will clean a lot of that stuff up as you go. The user centricity piece, obviously a big push. Again, that's not something that comes comfortably to government. Why? And that's not a criticism. None of this is criticism. It just recognises where we are in government, okay? Governments typically haven't had that outward focus, Other than the big commercial agencies like Aussie Post and those sort of ones, it doesn't come naturally. So how do you get user centricity? How do you start understanding that? And that's a challenge, okay? And it's one of those things where you've got to keep driving into it and understanding it. And it's a big, it's a term that's been thrown around, but we've got to get good at it. And we've got to hear and understand it. So as big drivers, they're the sort of ones to sort of look. And then where does it sort of end up from there? I think the platform piece is where it starts, pretty quickly moving. UK government's probably 3 years ahead of where we are, and they're starting to very aggressively talk about government as a platform. What does it mean? Well, one example is transactions. Why don't we just bring all transactions onto one big platform, okay? And push it at that level, right? And then provocatively, I'd say, you know what? We actually have 4 banks that do this really well, really well. This is where government's got to challenge itself, okay? I'm not a great fan, sorry to tell you, of spending $450 million on a welfare distribution platform, right? I think we've got payment platforms already built and we could build on top of that, right? And that's what I mean. We've got to start provoking ourselves and saying, we've got big institutional structures we could work with here. You white label that in. It's ditto for tax. In tax we collect money. We collect about 100 and we spend bit more than that. Collect 100 bill and we spend a bit more. And so they're 2 big platforms that, and I think they're ones we could really challenge ourselves to think about. Is anyone pushing that view? Not that I'm aware of, right? So we've got to start those debates, and you guys sit at levels where you see this and you see it. And we've got leaders who don't quite get it. So it's a really important role, I think, for groups like this who can see that sort of stuff and have good, strong technical skill sets and strong views to start propagating and asking those provocative questions, okay? So this is where it starts to move to platforms. Another platform I think will be licensing and compliance. So, we do that in many different ways. Well, why? Essentially it's the same thing. You essentially go through a licensing exercise and then there's a compliance exercise. There's a whole relationship management piece. I think this is much trickier, by the way. A lot of the digital transaction piece is interesting. The transformation piece at the moment is very transactional driven. It gets a lot trickier once you've got to start doing the soft stuff, okay? Healthcare is a good example of that, and we're going to move into that phase now, and we haven't got a lot of examples. Child Story is probably one, the one we talked about, family and community services. But I think that shift, well, it's not away. We'll have transactional service, but government's got a lot of soft services. We haven't really seen how digital works that piece, and that's, I think, a really interesting and exciting piece because I think it can really introduce a lot of innovation there. Security, obviously, I think is a big piece. I happen to think we're deluding ourselves on the security piece. And why do I say that? I think we haven't really worked out a robust way of thinking about it in government. We've got tick box type compliance exercise going on. We've got a lot of agencies sitting on infrastructure that's just, as we all know, so non-compliant. Any of those involved with the Bureau would know what I'm talking about. They got hacked last year. They didn't have logs. They couldn't run logs. So how do you run security when you have that? So it's just that we've got to get ourselves serious about the security piece. and really try and up that. I know there's big cyber security reviews going through P&C, and that'd be very important, but I just feel, we've let I've got one of my favourite sort of stories. I say, don't let the generals run the war, And I say, don't let with all respect to them, the DoD's types run the security piece. Yes, they're very important. Much more important are the people that are playing out in the big wide world and have to deal with this stuff all the time. We need to be part of that debate. And we can't have agencies sort of saying, oh, security is a fifth level issue. Yeah, I take it sort of seriously. It's time to get serious about it. And we've got to spend our money. It's a tricky area because you have 52 vendors in there all telling you need this, this and this, and there's not many aggregators or integrators. So we need to find a better integration story so that agencies aren't being knocked all over the place by all the vendors, and bring that together. So that security piece. The engagement piece, I think, is a big platform. Now, that really is GovCMS at the moment, and a really interesting example. I think it's a great example of that sort of bigger thinking. It's now 18 months into its run, and I think over the last 18 months, they'd be the first to admit they've learned a lot, and everyone's adjusted around that, and we'll keep learning on it. But it's a good platform for that type of thinking. More importantly is probably what you do with it, and we'll talk about that. But I think it becomes important, it becomes critical, the engagement piece, because there's flash services you like, but if you can't tell people about how they work and what they do, then it doesn't work as an exercise. Just checking our time here. Quickly, some problem. Now, most of you will just go, yeah, tell me something I don't know, but let's run through them. What are some of the issues? Very siloed, hierarchical design in public sector, okay? And, that has lots of issues when you're trying to run these things as system-wide propositions, okay? So we've got to find a way to jump out of that hierarchical architecture we're in and think of it in system levels, right? There's not many people who can do that. I'm not seeing a lot of vision coming out of PMC or others. There's some good early attempts. I think finance had some cracks at it, etc. But it's really having a strong vision that we're going to drive this thing at platform level. We're going to really try and exploit it. We're going to make calls what we're good at. We're going to get out of things we're not. And so that's tricky. And then within those silos, as we know, we've got some big agencies that play, okay? And we've got to find a way over the next 2 or 3 years where we can be responsible adults. It's really easy for everyone to sort of say, well, you go and do your thing and I'll do my thing and we'll work it out. Digital identity, really good example, okay? Really good example where if we get that organised, we'll move forward. We'll go forward really quickly. Joined up services will be easy, not easy, but much easier. Without that being worked out, if we sit here and have our little tribal wars, we all know who they are, okay, and we muck around with it and we sort of find 1,000 reasons why we can't work it out, okay, digital identity. This is the whole thing about authenticating people, okay, authenticate them once. What people want, real people, is they want to sign in once, okay, they want to tell government once, and they want a set of automated services behind there that says, well, okay, this how it's the same person. I can assume this person is going through a certain life cycle, and I can send them services, presumably under the hood. So if a kid's born at, when they turn 5, they just get their in New South Wales their bus pass, in Victoria their Mikey pass. That just comes automatically. So that's sort of where you want to be. You don't want to go to a website. Websites fail. You want that service to live in the background. So if that's going to happen, you're going to have to authenticate people and ID them and common ID them, right? There's a whole lot of problems in behind that because we've decided in our wisdom to have a federated system, right, where everyone can play. That's fine, but you've got to get at all the policies and the cost issues and the liability issues and and they're thorny. Finance did really good work on this a couple of years ago, but it sort of dropped in a hole. We've got to get that out of the cupboard and start working with it, okay? And that's a really good example, I think. If we don't, we'll be all running around in circles, big time. Leadership at the moment, I'm not talking about political leadership, which we said, it's been given a bit of whiff of fresh air. At the top end of the APS, great people, good people. I can say this because I've worked with most of them and understand them. They're all economists and lawyers, okay? They're not all, most, okay? And they don't think in that digital world, natively, okay? They're not digital natives. So we've got to educate them, and try and get them to think in those terms. They're very intelligent people, very happy to be part of it. They probably haven't got the fire in the belly, they haven't drunk the digital Kool-Aid piece yet. So there's plenty of FASs and ASs and ELs who have, but at that top level, I don't think so. Okay, but they're nodding and they're saying, yeah, I think we ought to get into it. Do they have a strong vision where? No. So that's a piece that's got to be worked through. Okay, it's just being realistic. I'm not being critical, I'm just being realistic. Okay, so if we look for these big system type understandings and where do we want to play and what we want to do, then we've got to inform that group. And it's a great time to do it, by the way. Fantastic opportunity. If you're 30, 35, what a great opportunity to really prosecute a strong vision for digital government as a way. Mobility, I think, we've got responsive design, great. But as we all know, mobility is not just responsive. It's really about a thought pattern that says, well, how do people consume on these things? And I'm a big fan of so-called material design. That's the Google word for essentially taking into account that people touch rather than click. Okay, and it's very different. Once you start playing with it, my father used to come and got an iPhone 6S, and it's very touch. It's got multiple levels. You got to touch hard and touch harder and touch. Oh, this is interesting. And so that whole UX starts to really change. So there's that piece, and then there's the actual, well, what are we delivering on these things? What is it, the proposition? And it's not just, the big desktop site delivered, in responsive design. We know that, but I think we've skirted it. And, the numbers are just ridiculously obvious. We've got to get serious about that. So design for mobile first and then the desktop later, is my observation. And UX, we've got to get the UX better. Those numbers coming out of the DTO, 50% of people think that government websites suck. Well, I reckon it's higher than that. And we've got to get serious, and, if it's that bad, pull the thing down, It's been, in some cases, better not to have it, than to put people through that pain. And we've seen it, we all know the stories, we understand it, but we've got to get it. And if we can't fix it all, fix some key pieces. And this is the next piece I really wanted to talk about. Really important piece. Built the website, got it going, what do we do? Okay, and it's called what I call driving the beast. Okay, and it's really, really important piece. And it's much underrated and underappreciated. At the moment, we broadly in government have IT over here and some web services who build it and run it. And over here we have comms and public relations and sometimes marketing over here. And at the moment, in most places, they're not connected. It's a very different floors, different places. And then over here, we've got the SES up here, who are busily wondering what it's all about, And so you got to bring, in my magic world, you bring the mob, the comms and marketing people and everything, and the web people and the IT people, and the SES into one, okay? And you sit them right next to the CEO's office, right next to the CEO. Why? Because it moves at pace. And the CEO's got to feel that pace, So the Secretary or Director General, whoever it is, has got to feel that pace and that movement, You're moving it up to and next to that floor, that gives it the importance it's got to have, okay? This is your public work, facing workshop. And if you don't take it seriously, then your brand is what gets killed and your agency gets killed. So that whole driving piece is really important. What are some of my quick advices on that? Take an industrial approach, okay? Building quickly, but take an industrial approach. What I mean by that, you're building a big piece of infrastructure over time. It's not just a quick fix. Have a big, heavyweight strategy, because government's about long term, and if you don't have that stuff, you're just building point solutions, whack it up on WordPress, but you've got to start thinking about it in strategic and deeper terms, so have that industrial. Thinking campaigns, why do I say that? I'm just getting 2 minutes on this. Once you start playing on the front end of all these websites, what you've got to do is manage all the people who come in and the journeys and everything they do and what their goals are and how they convert it, etc., etc. Right. That is a marketing play, okay? So you've got to understand what that journey is and what the campaign is you're trying to achieve. Governments typically don't think like that. They typically just say, okay, we've got a bunch of users that come and go. Occasionally they'll think in campaign terms. The intergenerational report last year was a good example of a campaign. Probably not a good example in execution, but it was a campaign. So think in campaign terms. You know. Everything is a campaign. And why do you think in campaign? You measure it. You measure it with an inch of its life. Okay? Why? Because that's where you get the insights. That's where you get the feedback. We talked about user centricity. That is your best form of feedback. As people use your sites and understand it. Think in those terms. So introduce the word campaign. You know, and in your calendar of internal workings, campaign 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Run through the year. Okay? And the BAU stuff is a campaign. Don't let people tell you BAU is just normal. No, it isn't normal. You know, put it around a campaign. It's our stuff where we're going to manage this particular piece. You know, and manage it and think of it like that. Analytics then become really important in that piece. So you've got to get savvy at it. Okay, and really try and bring analytics into your thinking. You know, I say to people, turn on real time. You know, in Google Analytics, put it up on screens. You know. Put it in your CEO's office, because all of a sudden they'll start saying, well, okay, what's going on here? Put it in your group where your comms and PR people are and public affairs. Put it in web people and start understanding your GA numbers, your Google Analytic numbers, or whatever metric you're using. Why? Because it starts to really tell you stuff. You know, it tells you who's there at any particular time. It tells you the channels they're coming to you, okay? We'll quickly talk to that. It gives you the referrals, who's actually pushing you through. It gives you those insights. Most importantly, you can build goals into it. So it gives purpose. And this idea where we just put stuff up and wonder how it might go has got to stop in government, okay? Too many people just put it up there and wonder what will happen, okay? Goals, okay? Set goals, manage it like that and understand it. And think about the whole universe. So what do we mean by the universe? Well, in content terms, this is probably my last point. Content is what ultimately wraps around these pieces, you know, the transactional exercise. Content these days is a distribution game. Yeah, let me say that again. Content is a distribution game. That means you start with thinking about, before you build any piece of content, you say, well, who's going to consume this content and where, okay? So if they're all on Facebook, okay, that's where most of your users are for this particular campaign. Well, guess what? In Facebook, they're not going to put up with 3,000 words. They're not going to put up with a PDF. They're not going to put up with a video that runs 42 minutes, okay? They want an infographic, or they just want, you know, 5 things I need to know. So distribution drives content, okay? And once you start thinking about that, the second most obvious point is that's your whole universe. Think of it as a universe, okay? So you've got your website. Your website in many cases might just be a small bit in the play. It might be the hub. The majority of plays out there. So it says to you, really think about that, you know, and that's the way you think about it, you know. And so you start with that universe of, you know, I call it the social diaspora, you know, where all the people are that play in your space. And think of it like that, and you'll design it accordingly, and you'll design the website accordingly, you know. So the website's really just a hub of various things that go on there, that makes things. So content is hard. It is, you can make bad content, that's easy, right? Good content is hard, and you've got to think it through. Why? Because the content's got to have the narrative that tells the story you want. That's not easy, you know. Why? Because often in public sector, they don't even know what they want to say, okay? And then when they do know what they want to say, they want to put 1,000 caveats around it. So we've got to get out of that thinking, you know, simplify it, make the story sensible, you know, and drive it. And that's what I mean by hard. You're taking a culture that is not ready and willing to simplify and make things straightforward, and, you know, plain English, please, and, you know, make it in words that people can understand, and make it in sentences that are about 16 words long, etc. You know, so think in those terms, and we've got a whole culture that's not doing that. Listen as people consume, because you'll learn a lot. But really listen. Don't just sort of, you know, oh yeah, okay, listen, you know, because it's amazing what you'll hear. 80-20 is a great rule. You know, have a look at people using the website. Typically, it's 80% of stuff will be, 80% of people will consume 20% of stuff. That's your friend. You know, so you say, okay, let's just focus on the 20%. Okay, and the 20% is the stuff that most people use. Whereas in most government agencies, you know, what typically people do is they just put it all up there. So, can we get over that? 20%, focus on it, you know, and then push the rest, you know, somewhere else, you know, as an exercise. And then all of a sudden you'll start seeing, you know, it's a lot easier. A couple of last, can I say, pieces from the pulpit, okay? And you've probably heard it, but I'll say it. This is me evangelising, but just to finish. Stay light if you can, LITE I call it, right? Why? Because, digital's so quick moving, okay? I think just, if you go back and look at design over the last 4 years, we've gone, through 3 iterations, we're now to parallax scrolling, before that we're in tiles, before that, who knows, and now we're going to materials. So stay light, it's just moving too quickly. By that I mean don't go building big, build it light, get it out there, be quick, okay? And we call it agile, whatever, but it's a real philosophy and you've got to really try and, push yourself to do it, and push your agency to think like that. Build light, build quickly is the other piece that goes with that. And improve it, as you go. So nothing works better than having real users use your site, And once they start using it, gee, that's much, much better than any focus groups or, other stuff that you've used to help build the site. So build it light, keep it simple, really simple in terms of the IA, and let Google be your friend and people will find the content. And then iterate quickly off that. Now that's the digital, mantra, but it's so true, so true. The philosophical point is, trying to get people to understand that, build it light, get going. Avoid customisation, in government. Someone said to me, the guy's head of, his CIO for Estonia, and Estonia's easy. That's the last country, I forgot it, in the D5. Okay, they're easily the most savvy digital country I think in the world, and he said, the interesting thing, Tom, about government essentially does the same thing worldwide. They issue dog licenses, they issue passports. Why are we reinventing it? Why are we reinventing it? And it's a really provocative thought. It is. It's a very customised, essentially, managed exercise. So let's use that as an exercise. All right. Very last piece. I think the governance piece is really important. As an exercise, we've got to bring our agencies with us. There's no point, being the digital whiz kids over here and having websites and going there, and all the old people sitting over there. So trying to get your governance arrangement where people are natively working with the digital piece. They might not be comfortable with it, but there's nothing like doing this stuff to learn. So really trying to set up the governance piece at the highest level so it's owned by the top executive group and they take a real interest in it. So from an architecture perspective, there's real investment in it. And that will then give you, if you like, the permission to do, because once people start seeing it, they say, oh, okay, this is different, and off we go. I think that's where I'll end. Thank you very much.